She checked if he was breathing before she let herself sleep. Every night, for 4 years, she would lie in the dark of Graceland and listen, not to the Memphis quiet outside the gates, not to the house settling around her, but to him, the rhythm of his breath, whether it was regular or shallow, whether it slowed in a way that required her to wake him, whether the medication had carried him somewhere she could not reach from the other side of the bed. This was her life between 1972 and 1976. Not the glamour version, not the story people reach for when they talk about the women who loved Elvis Presley. The actual life, the 3 in the morning life, the listening to him breathe life, the life of a woman who had walked into a room expecting a legend and found instead something nobody outside those gates was permitted to see. The king was fragile, privately, increasingly, catastrophically fragile, and Linda Thompson was the person holding the pieces together in the dark. Of gore that had built before Elvis, Linda Thompson was already someone. That matters. It matters the way it mattered with Anne Margaret, that the women who truly reached him were never women who needed him to be complete. They arrived carrying their own gravity, their own direction, their own sense of themselves that existed before he appeared in the frame. Linda Thompson was 22 years old in the summer of 1972. She had been crowned Miss Memphis, then Miss Tennessee. She was beautiful in a way photographs of that era cannot fully transmit. Something in the quality of her presence, the intelligence inside it, the specific warmth that made people feel she was genuinely glad they existed. She was funny. That part always gets left out of the accounts, and it may be the most important part. Elvis Presley, behind the gates of Graceland, surrounded by men whose function was to reflect him back to himself, had very few people left in his life who made him genuinely, involuntarily laugh. Linda was one of them. The laughter between them, easy, real, the laughter of two people whose senses of humor found each other without effort, was one of the first things she gave him, and among the last things he managed to give back. They met in July of 1972, not at an industry event, at the Memphian Theater, a private screening, the kind of night Elvis had been hosting for years, renting the entire place after closing so he could watch films without triggering the collapse of any public space he entered. His people extended an invitation through a mutual connection. Linda came. She sat in the dark and watched the screen. Elvis noticed her immediately, which was how Elvis worked in a room. He introduced himself. She did not collapse. She did not perform amazement. She looked at him with the calm of a woman who had decided in advance to respond to whoever was in front of her, not to what the world had decided that person was. He was, by most accounts, immediately undone by this. He called her the next day, and the day after. Within weeks, her presence in his life had stopped being an event and become a condition. Something that, once established, revealed by its existence exactly how long he had been without it. Graceland in the early 1970s existed entirely on Elvis's schedule and no one else's. The gates closed. Memphis went about its life on the other side. Inside, the staff, the Memphis Mafia, the rotating cast of men who had organized their identities around his proximity, and a rhythm of days and nights that bore no relationship to how ordinary people moved through time. Elvis slept until 3 or 4 in the afternoon. He was awake until dawn. The house stayed lit through the night, the screening room running, the kitchen open, the men available to fill whatever hours he needed filled. Linda moved into Graceland within months of their first meeting. She did not arrive with a plan to become his caretaker. She arrived because she loved him, and because the architecture of his life left no middle position. You were inside it, or you were not. What she found inside it, nobody had prepared her for. The pharmaceutical regimen was already elaborate. Dr. George Nicopolis, Dr. Nick, had been managing Elvis's prescriptions for years, calibrating the chemistry of his sleep and wakefulness with the precision of a man maintaining a mechanism rather than healing a person. Uppers to start the day, downers to end it, painkillers for the chronic back condition, sedatives for the anxiety that lived in Elvis's chest like a permanent tenant who paid no rent and could not be evicted. The medications worked, in the narrow technical sense. They kept the schedule. They kept Elvis functional enough to perform, to record, to exist within the demands that Colonel Tom Parker's contracts and Graceland's operating costs jointly required. What they could not provide was real rest, the kind of unconsciousness that replenishes rather than merely suspends. Elvis woke often, sometimes violently, sometimes just surfacing, blinking in the dark, turning toward Linda with the disorientation of someone who does not immediately know where he is. And Linda, who had not been asked to do this, who had no training for it and no manual and no one to tell her if what she was doing was helping or simply extending something already past saving, would reach for his hand in the dark. "I'm here. It's all right. I'm here." The insomnia was its own country, with its own laws and its own weather. Elvis had been sleeping badly for years before Linda arrived. Sleep, genuine, unmanaged, natural sleep, had become something that happened to other people. The medications replaced it with something that resembled it from the outside and delivered almost none of what it was supposed to. So the nights ran long and formless. He watched films until 4 in the morning. He read the spiritual texts, the numerology volumes, the worn Yogananda he carried everywhere and pressed into the hands of anyone who seemed to be searching. He talked, and Elvis in the late-night hours was a different creature from Elvis at the start of an evening. The performance gone, the defenses down, the accumulated weight of everything he was carrying visible in a way the stage and the public face would never permit. Linda was there for those hours. She did not find them easy. She found them irreplaceable, because what Elvis gave to the dark and the quiet and the one person willing to stay awake beside him was real, unmanaged, unperformed, the actual interior life of a man who had been famous since 21 and had almost no experience of being fully known. He talked about God. He talked about his mother with the raw, unhealable grief of a man who had lost her before he was old enough to protect himself from the loss. He talked about what he believed his life was for, what it had always been for, and about the growing fear that the distance between what he was and what the world required of him had widened past anything he knew how to bridge. He talked, in those hours, about dying, not dramatically, not as a declaration. The way a person who has quietly, internally begun to make certain calculations refers to their own mortality, obliquely, at the edges, in language that could be read as philosophical rather than personal if you were not paying close enough attention. Linda paid close attention. She told him he was wrong. She told him there was more time, more music, more mornings with Lisa Marie in the grounds. She said it with the gentle ferocity of a woman who has decided that if she keeps saying it long enough, with enough truth behind it, eventually he will believe it too. Some nights he seemed to, not have. There were nights she saved his life, not as a figure of speech, literally. Nights when the medication tipped past its intended balance, when the breathing slowed beyond what sleep explains, when Linda, lying beside him with every nerve awake in the particular alertness that 4 years of vigilance had built into her body permanently, felt the rhythm change and understood immediately what it meant. She woke him, sometimes gently, sometimes with the flat urgency of a woman who has no time for gentleness. She called Dr. Nick. She managed the aftermath, the disorientation, the irritability, the specific shame of a man caught at his own fragility by the person whose love he most wanted to deserve. She absorbed all of it, without the resentment that would have been entirely human and entirely understandable. She stayed. The men of the Memphis Mafia understood what Linda was doing in ways they rarely articulated out loud. Red West understood it. Charlie Hodge understood it. The people who had been with Elvis since the beginning, who had watched the dependency deepen year by year with a helplessness that had long since calcified into a kind of complicity. They understood that Linda Thompson was doing something none of them had the capacity to do. She was loving him honestly, in the dark, without the buffer of performance or the comfortable distance of yes. Mew-core, but love sustained at that intensity, against that much, for that long. It costs. Linda did not speak publicly about the cost for many years. When she finally did, in the memoir she wrote decades after his death, she found the words with the care of someone who has spent a long time locating the truth of a complicated thing. She said she loved Elvis more than she had loved anyone. She said it without qualification. She also said that living inside the machinery of his self-destruction, watching someone she loved move toward an edge that everyone around him had agreed not to name, carrying the nightly terror of checking whether he was breathing, being the last line between him and the dark. It hollowed something in her she hadn't known was hollow until it was done. She was 26 years old in 1976. 4 years of vigilance. 4 years of waking at odd hours to the sound of a breath that wasn't quite right. 4 years of carrying the weight of keeping alive a man who was not, in any way she could identify, doing the same work for himself. She did not leave in anger. Anger would have been cleaner, and her departure was not clean. She left because she had arrived, somewhere in the long nights of 1976, at the understanding that she could not save him, that the love she had given in full measure had not been enough, not because she had given it imperfectly, but because what was happening to Elvis Presley was past the reach of anything one person could do for another inside those gates. She could stay and watch. She left. Money Smith. Elvis Presley died on August 16, 1977. Linda was not at Graceland. She had been gone nearly a year. She heard the news the way everyone heard it. A call, the radio, an ordinary afternoon broken open by something that had been approaching for a long time and still arrived without preparation. She wept, not for the king, for the man who had introduced himself to her in a dark movie theater in Memphis in the summer of 1972, and made her feel, within minutes, that she was genuinely seen, for the man who laughed in ways that could not be manufactured, who talked about God in the quiet hours, and called out for her in the dark, with a need so unguarded it left no room for anything false, for the man who, beneath everything the world had made of him, was simply and painfully human in the way that only people forced to live entirely in public ever fully become. In the decades since, Linda Thompson has spoken about Elvis with a consistency that amounts to its own kind of testimony, careful, warm, honest about what it cost, and unashamed of what it gave. She says she never stopped loving him. She does not mean the king. We tell the story of those final years in the language of decline, the weight, the medication, the nights when the voice failed and the man on stage looked like a diminished version of what he had been. That story is not wrong. It is simply incomplete because inside those same years, on the other side of the gates, something else was also true. A woman lay awake listening to a man breathe. She reached for his hand when the nightmares surfaced. She said his name into the dark and waited for him to answer. She loved him, fully, with complete knowledge of what she was loving, and asked nothing in return except that he still be there when morning came. For 4 years, he was. She made that possible, and the king, in the private hours before dawn, with the performance finally suspended and the gates closed and Memphis quiet outside, was simply a man who needed someone to stay. Linda Thompson stayed. That was the most extraordinary thing she ever did, and he knew it in the way he knew the truest things about himself. Quietly, and completely, and without a word,